Greetings. Welcome to the panel on Blackness, Buddhism, and Trauma. Our panelists include clinical psychologist, Vajrayana Tantric Buddhist practitioner and writer, Dr. G, clinical social worker, professor, researcher, and writer, Soka Gakkai leader, and the voice of Black and Buddhist audiobook on Audible, Dr. Kamilah Majied, and end-of-life caregiver, chaplain, and sex and grief coach, Breeshia Wade, author of the forthcoming book, Grieving While Black, an anti-racist take on oppression and sorrow. So thank you all for your presence today. We have three panelists. Each of them wear many hats, and we're approaching the complex topic of trauma as it relates to being Black, which is also complex, and Buddhist, which is also complex. And we're going to try to touch on all this complexity in less than 1 hour with time for Q&A. So let's see what we can do together in this time. People often ask me, and they may ask you all, why are Black folks flocking to Buddhism? And I know that there's not just one answer to that question. I know that. But panelists, I'm wondering if you think one of those answers could be that within some of the Buddhist communities, some of them, Black folks can talk about their mental and emotional challenges without being stigmatized as being weak for suffering. Anybody can begin.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the reasons. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Yetunde and the Awake Network for hosting this wonderful forum and this beautiful opportunity for us to be together and think about the application of Buddhism to navigation of trauma. And one thing I want to say just before I say anything else, just out of deep appreciation for all of the folks who have spoken during the Black and Buddhist Summit and those here with me today, it's just this little thing that Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams said about practicing the magic of attribution. And I want to mention it because what she said when she talked about it was that oftentimes when Black people are cited for their insights and their wisdom and their work, they are not cited. That it's more often the case that when non-Black people share something that they are attributed for the work. And the magic of attribution allows for us to build community across different wisdom traditions and cultural and ethnic traditions as well. So I just want to lift up that, that piece of insight about practicing the magic of attribution as folks gather the recordings and the insights from all these amazing teachers. And in very short answer to your question, I think that because Buddhism elucidates that there is suffering and we work right in that realm, right? And that there is a path to ending suffering, right? That these are the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering, there's a path to end suffering, and that we can awaken to that path by practicing Buddhism. I think that that is attractive to many people who suffer deeply, including Black people.
Thank you, Kamilah.
I am excited to be here with all of you. And I really appreciate this question as I'm sitting with it. I'm thinking about my own experience growing up Southern Baptist in South Carolina with a family, a grandmother who just found out I'm practicing Buddhism, even though I've been practicing for 10 years because the book is coming out, right? And now people are calling her and they're like, Breeshia's Buddhist? She switched her religion. So, it was hard enough for her to make sense of the fact that I have a wife and my wife is Jewish, and then add Buddhism in the mix, and it's a lot for grandma. Grandma, needs me to slow down a little bit. But I'm reflecting on some of the conversations I participated in, specifically at churches when doing chaplaincy work. And I remember there was one question I received, or I received in particular is, what is it that pushed you away from God or from Christianity, or why did you leave the church, and how can we get you back? And I really sat with that question. And for me, I feel that Buddhism has allowed me to expand my definition of myself and my relationship with God. So I don't feel like I abandoned God. I don't feel abandoned by God. I don't feel that this practice has to be divorced from or separate from any other practice that has informed me as I've grown up. And I think that as Black people, we've been given such limited definitions of ourselves as a part of the racial trauma that we've experienced in the US. And for me personally, Buddhism has allowed me to explore and expand that. And in expanding that, I've expanded my compassion for myself and my community and the suffering we've endured. And I've been able to show up with an open heart and a new perspective.
Thank you, Breeshia. Thank you. Dr. G.
Thank you, family. So good to be with you all today. And just to support and echo and continue. Buddhism brought me back to humanity. I think as far as the space, spiritual spaces I had danced in, no space had reflected the breadth of the human experience as much as this space did. And with that came a myriad of emotional experience that was just a part of the human condition. So I didn't feel like I had to part and parcel aspects of my being and my humanity. And that gave me just space for it to be witnessed, which is tremendous. Gave me words and has given other people words for their emotional experience, which often, I know about y'all, I've been speaking to my elders and they're like, we just need to keep on, like keep moving. It's like, well, what are we moving from? Like, what was that? Like, what was that? So really being able to like label, name, and witness has brought tremendous healing for a lot of people where they can really move into the breadth of their humanity. And, from the tradition that I'm coming from as well, just the fundamental ground of goodness that, that is our seed, and we are having experience that we have judgment around was completely eye-opening and freeing. I was like, wow, like that my being, your being, like we're all in agreement that that's our ground. Wow, that freed me up, that freed many people up tremendously.
Thank you, Dr. G. So I would say, based on your experiences, that it would be unusual for an African descended person to enter into a Buddhist Sangha, say that they're suffering, and be stigmatized for that. It's like, yeah, the First Noble Truth, we're all suffering. And I think that's part of what's attractive about Buddhism to Black folks. So I would like to move a little more deeply into this thing called trauma. And in the United States, in this context, as I listen to people, and I listen to people sometimes with the ears of a psychotherapist, so that's what I'm listening for, I frequently hear people talk openly about being traumatized, as if there's actually no stigma at all in claiming trauma. Yet, there's still no shared definition of the term. What does trauma mean? From your professional locations as a clinical psychologist, Dr. G, as a clinical social worker and professor, Dr. Kamilah, and from the perspective of the end of life caregiver, chaplain, grief and sex coach, Breeshia, in 1 minute, please tell us how you define trauma. Anyone can begin.
I can start. A situation or event that happens too quickly and that overwhelms the person's being.
I'll slide in here. Anything that feels like a breaking or fracturing of oneself, without the resources, including time, to be able to heal and reincorporate.
Can you say that again, Breeshia, because you faded out a little bit? I want everyone to hear it.
Yeah, anything that results in the fracturing of oneself without being given the resources or support, time, community to heal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Trauma is suffering, and I bring it to that because I think sometimes people start to talk about trauma as if it exists in some other realm. It's like paranormal suffering, which it's not. It's suffering, and it's defined clinically as disturbing events, or disturbing series or ongoing persistent events that cause so much distress that it exceeds our perceived notions of our ability to cope and alters our sense of safety and meaning. So those are some key aspects that I see, that trauma is a seriously distressing event or series of persistent events that are so distressing they exceed our perceived capacity to cope, our perceived sense of our ability to cope, and also can change our worldview, our sense of meaning, purpose, value.
Thank you. I heard you give two definitions, but that's okay. The clinical definition and your definition. And I also heard in what you said, you stressed twice the word perceived, which is so critical in Buddhist practice, to pay attention to how we see things, to come to the right understanding of things. So I'm listening to all of you. I now want to turn to your writings. Dr. G, this is from your piece Conception in the Arrow Journal, a journal of Wakeful Society, Culture and Politics, published on October 26, 2020. You write, it's just an excerpt from this poem. Now, as limp limbs crumble, decay, back to Eden, you crave it. Objectify out of love to feed your own intolerable itch to do something, except what should be done. Curfews, your excuse to hide. Play night. I can't hide underground with you, or above, shielded. It's a body you're after, a collection of bones, fashioning the entertainment you drown yourself in. Sports, concerts, gatherings, clubs, bars canceled. So you satiate, clickbait, surf ad nauseum on each new video death. Each headline, an adrenaline rush. Intoxication of the decay to avert your gaze from self. I can surrender to protecting this body. There is more that is untouchable. As each being burns and hangs, they dissolve into the soil beneath your feet, and they will all return. Shake volcanoes to eruptions, swell seas to tsunamis, crack earth, and swallow your empire whole. Dr. G, what are you saying here about trauma, Black bodies, and Buddhism?
Thank you for reading that piece. I'm not the only one saying. So just a quick note, my writing is channeled. The ancestors are saying, don't be distracted. Don't be distracted by the ways with which our bodies are used, that the Black body is used for entertainment historically, for service, for labor, for being the container for all that people don't want to look at. This is merely, a hybrid poem illustrating the ways with which this time of COVID, this time of seeing Black people being senselessly killed has become the new entertainment in the absence of sports and all our other usual distractions. And so when I think about like coming back to ground, coming back to like what matters, that coming back is the practice of meditation. It's the practice of coming back to who are we? Who are we at our roots? And we are far more, Black people are far more than the bodies and the labels and the attributes that are given to us oftentimes by other people. We are the very soil that produces the fruits of this earth. So let's resource ourselves back to our fundamental goodness that is beyond, in some ways, even I can imagine. So that's the offering in that piece.
It's a very powerful offering, and thank you for being a vessel, a channel. And also, okay, let me not go there. We don't have time to interpret this poem, what this poem means to me, but let me just say, wow. Okay, Breeshia, I have an excerpt from your book, Grieving While Black, and I'm going to read a portion of it. Often, when people imagine what it means for Black lives to matter, they focus on the explicit death of Black people, like those caused by police violence. Almost every system of injustice within the United States is either founded upon or informed by anti-Blackness, including racism and white supremacy. Consequently, there are a myriad of ways that anti-Blackness ensures that Black folks are not meant to live, let alone thrive. Many of my readers likely participate in the destruction of Black lives despite their political and social leanings, unwittingly and against their best intentions. At its core, anti-Blackness neither relies upon our consent nor our awareness to extract participation. So Breeshia, I've got a question for you regarding this excerpt. Is there something about this excerpt that does not address trauma, Black bodies, and Buddhism? Because it seems to me to encapsulate the situation, but there may be more.
Thank you for sharing that excerpt. And I'm trying to need a moment as I think through that question because I wasn't prepared for that. I like that. What is not encapsulated got me thinking on my feet. So, man. When I think through what I was feeling and what I feel hearing someone, read those words and the experience of being Black in community with people who have experienced profound suffering and how that relates to the Four Noble Truths of suffering. The four Noble Truths touch on the reality of impermanence. That's where suffering arises. And anytime you're talking about impermanence, you're talking about loss. And anytime you're talking about loss, you're talking about grief. And frequently grief and trauma go hand in hand. Like I love Dr. Kamilah's two definitions in the way that she talked about the way that we perceive grief, perceive trauma, the way it's talked about, I guess, clinically versus the way that it's experienced. And when I think about the losses that we as Black folks have faced, are facing as a result of what it means to be Black in America, I think immediately of how that is tied to impermanence and to the losses that we're non-consensually facing, whether it's the loss of a job opportunity because of our name, whether it's the loss of safety when we are walking down the street in a Black body, whether it's the loss of feeling of connection or community, where we're walking through our own neighborhood and we feel other and out of place, and how that loss and that severing of connection comes hand in hand with the grief and trauma that our oppressor also feels. or oppressors feel with relationship to their fear of impermanence. And then how that gets siphoned back and pushed back onto us and to our bodies. And that's something we're constantly moving through and moving with. And as you all know, since I am in community with people who share this sentiment, the losses compound and it feels profound and overwhelming at times. And that just brings me back to the practice and why we're here.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, that excerpt could not possibly contain all the depth of what you're talking about, the recognition and the reality of impermanence. And that's why we have to read the book, right? You can't just, seriously, I can't wait for this book. And let me just say one thing. When I first saw that title, I thought, damn, that's the first word that came to my mind because, well, here we go again. I want to talk about it, but we don't have much time. So let me move on. Okay. But you get it. You get it. Y'all get it. All right. Kamilah, I read both of your articles and I was like, oh my gosh, Kamilah, you are so brilliant. You are able to do so many things, the way you think, the words you use. You really know how to make your point. Let me put it that way. In your academic article, The Impact of Sexual Orientation and Gender Expression Bias on African American Students, you write, Black students who identify as LGBTQ in the research indicated that they often avoid coming out as gay, may feel alienated from the LGBT community at large, and find it difficult to integrate their sexual orientation and their Black identity. In addition, Black youth who are attracted to the same sex appear to be at risk for emotional disturbances due to their experience of homophobia or heterosexism. It is not only social scientists who recognize the prevalence of anti-gay sentiment among Black youth. Homophobic words are often used to describe weaker or lesser men in hip hop music, even though some rappers have openly condemned these sentiments. Hip hop, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, filmmaker Byron Hurt explored homophobia and exaggerated notions of masculinity as an unfortunate constituent of hip hop culture. And so, Dr. Kamilah, I have a question for you. Given the high visibility of Black queer Buddhist leaders, what should be our takeaway from your research as it relates to the attraction Black queer people have to the Black queer leaders and are coming into sanghas that may or may not be led by Black queer Dharma leaders?
The unmute button wasn't working, so that gave me excellent time to pause and breathe, you know, with your question. And it's amazing how you have these wonderful prepared questions for us, Dr. Yetunde. It's so lovely. And I can say that, you know, I think that one of the wonderful things that the Black Buddhist community internationally is doing is saying the spectrum of human experience is broad and indescribable. You know, so whatever lists and taxonomies of identity and experience you've come up with to describe how people love, how people interrelate are all, you know, transient and incomplete, right? So I think that's a piece of wisdom that's imbuing the whole realm, and particularly as it comes from Black people who have and do triumph daily over the challenge of racism, yet in the context of our families, often have either spoken or unspoken heterosexism and homophobia abiding. This is true in Black institutions as well. It's kind of a silent abiding. It's a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. And it's evolving. And that evolution is also being influenced by the presence of Buddhist teachers and leaders in the realm who are encouraging people and saying, you know, all of who you are is magnificence. And in fact, your transcendence of these limitations around who it is appropriate to love, who it is appropriate to be in a body, are evidence of the Buddhist teachings of transcendence, you know, of limitation. So I think there's just a wonderful symmetry between those things. And, you know, when I talk about in Black and Buddhist, when I talk about suffering, like all the different kinds of suffering, specifically, I talk about death, you know, and how birth and death, for birth, aging, sickness, death, that these sufferings often come immediately for some Black people. They come at the same time, and that's because of the health disparities, right? But the reality of the traumas that we experience, either as Black LGBTQ people, Black, you know, cis or hetero people, or as people of other ethnicities, that all suffering, there is a cause for all suffering. There is an end to suffering, and there is a path to ending suffering. And that's what Buddhism offers, that enlightens this entire realm, right? So the traumatic experiences, yes, abound in my research internationally and domestically. The traumatic experiences I heard about and listened to people document, saw people document in the surveys around racism, you know, ranging from the verbal to the physically violent, and around homophobia, verbal to extreme physical violence, were profound examples of trauma. Yet that whole section in my forthcoming book, Joyfully Just, is titled Trauma Transcended, because people were constantly figuring out how to manifest post-traumatic growth, which is something I'd love to talk a little bit about when it's time.
Yeah, thank you. If we have time. I didn't know about your forthcoming book, so would you please say the title again?
It's called Joyfully Just, and it's using meditation practices, contemplative practices, to transcend injustice.
Okay, excellent. All right, keep your eyes and ears open for Joyfully Just. Should be released when?
The fall of this year.
Oh, excellent. Okay, excellent.
Yes, and you can go to KamilahMajied.com or joyfullyjust.com to find out more.
Okay, all right. So we've got at least 2 serious books coming out. And who knows what's going to come out of Dr. G, because Dr. G is channeling. Anything could come out. So y'all got to be aware that could happen. Okay, I've got one more question for you all. But before I do that, I want to give instructions for the Q&A. Okay, so soon we're going to have the opportunity for some live questions and live answers from our panelists. If you'd like to ask a question live, if you want to do this live, please write. Oh, sorry. Okay, I was looking at the chat. Please write your question. I'm sorry, let me do it this way. Please go to the Q&A function. Before you write anything about your question or your name, write the word live first. Okay. Write the word live, followed by your name, and then your question. Okay. Don't do that in the chat, but in the Q&A. So if we call on you, if we have time to answer your question, by your writing live, you're letting us know that you actually have a microphone and a camera. Okay. So if we choose your question, knowing that you have a microphone and a camera, in about 5 minutes after you write your question, you're going to hear me call your name. And then you're going to be brought onto the screen, onto the community live. So please be ready when that happens. A window will pop up asking you to enable your camera and your microphone. And so please click yes, and then you will be on. Okay, so in these next few minutes, please write in your questions in the Q&A, starting with the word live. Okay, and while you do that, I've got one more question for our panelists. Okay, so I told you I listen sometimes with the ears of a psychotherapist, and I teach this course called Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy. And in that course, we spend a lot of time with psychotherapists helping them understand the importance of and become skilled in the integration of mindfulness practices and meditation uh, uh, practices into traditional psychotherapy. So, given that we do that there, my question to you all is, what do you have to say about the integration of being trauma informed within sanghas? Is there an obligation for sanghas to be trauma informed?
Well, I'll share with you one of the interesting things that happened some 38 years ago when I joined my Sangha, the Soka Gakkai, was that I realized that people, when somebody went through a suffering, lost a job or a relationship ended, the more senior practitioners would say, congratulations, like this is a great opportunity. Like the whole practice of Buddhism is about changing your karma into mission and transmuting the suffering so that, the opportunity to, the possibility of viewing suffering that way abounds in the Buddhist community and is available in the Buddhist community. Do I think it's valuable for people to say, yes, as you begin to practice the mud that's in the life of your experience, the pain that is part of your personal and familial and communal legacy will start to emerge, because that's how things get clarified. We come to understand what's painful, right? Your perception clears, and the first thing that clears is the perception of how much pain you've been in, and once that happens, it can feel overwhelming. So I do think people can be made aware of it. Yet I feel like we have to roll back this tendency to dramatize trauma as if, again, it's some kind of extraordinary suffering. Trauma has existed, since the beginning of time, and the four sufferings, anybody who's had a painful birth can tell you, any of the sufferings can be traumatic, or depending on how we perceive them and decide to re-perceive them, we can transform the trauma in the moment by changing the way that we respond to it. The paramis speak to, approaching it with equanimity, approaching it with resolve. So when people were saying congratulations to me in the SGI, when I negotiated a major struggle, they were saying, this is an opportunity for you to build your resolve, your determination, and to see this as perception, as although it may transcend the capabilities you feel you have now to cope, it will open the door to other coping skills, mechanisms, resources that you never knew you had and never would have had to access. And that's how post-traumatic growth happens.
Thank you, Kamilah. We've got 9 questions. I'd like to hear from Breeshia and from Dr. G about whether you think sanghas have, I'll put it this way, an ethical obligation to be better informed about trauma. What do you think?
I'm going to give a short answer, yes. And I'm specifically, thinking about the fact that when you're inviting people into their body and into their experience, so that they can and then be mindful, trauma is experienced and perceived within the body. And I especially, bringing it back to the panel topic, as a Black woman who has practiced in quite a few almost all white sanghas, right? And what it's been like to go to sesshin and to sit and to feel that porousness while being surrounded by people who have historically and are actively, like during sesshin, even without speaking a word, have actively contributed to the trauma of what it means for me to be a Black woman in my body. And I've spoken up about this many times when I've been in these spaces. Oh, excuse me. And sometimes it's received well, and if it's not, I just don't go back. But ultimately, I believe that if these communities are opening up the Dharma and the teachings to everyone, and if the idea is to alleviate suffering for everyone in the world, then we need to be conscientious about who is in the world and what those bodies in the world experience as a result of who they are. And that does involve a trauma trauma-informed approach.
Thank you, Breeshia. Dr. G. And then we'll go to the questions.
I too will keep it super brief and echo yes. I do think that things happen, in these sanghas that can be harmful. And we have to know both in the absolute sense, how to work with it on a spiritual level and how to apply the spiritual teachings as a source of resource for our growth. And that is what has kept us resilient. That is what has kept us alive and still thriving amidst all the things that we as Black people have suffered through. And on a very relative level, sometimes we need more. And so this is where I feel like sanghas need to be connected with their communities. If they cannot hold that informed approach within their spaces, then they need to have community and access to community resources outside to say like, hey, we are beings a part of the world, and can we be in collaboration of how we can create a safer environment? Because I don't think that sanghas alone know all there is to know to be able to support beings on their journey. So both and let's spread out.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for this Black excellence. I don't know why are people laughing about what I'm saying? It's true. Okay, I'm going to the Q&A and I'm going to, let's see. Now I've got live. It's Crystal Eubanks. Come on in, Crystal.
Yo, I made myself peace and light. Awesome. My question is, it was somewhat answered as you all were talking, but with consistently experiencing trauma as a woman in my skin and as a woman with children, I just wanted to know, how is it that I'm able to consistently heal from it? I know it builds resilience, but I feel like I'm so resilient already. And I'm just really trying to find my way through it. Like, if you could give me some type of encouragement in what practices you all do or have currently, it would really help me a lot.
Thank you, Crystal. Panelists?
Thank you.
I was gonna let the therapist take this first, but since we all on mute, I'll go ahead and drop a line in here about my experience. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I feel it's important to acknowledge I'm not a mother, but I'm a Black woman, a queer Black woman in my body. And I can empathize with the sentiment of feeling resilient, and also, what does it mean to heal from one's trauma when one is constantly experiencing that trauma because you're in the environment in which it's happening all the time. And for me, I've started approaching healing as a process instead of like a state where I'm transformed and I'm no longer affected by or experiencing that suffering. And, I use my practice to really ground myself in the moment, to ask what do I, as someone who is suffering in this moment, needs? And then I take steps and I go from there. Thank you again.
And just to add very quickly, moment to moment, the practice is in every moment. And so sometimes there will be one moment that is a sense of exhale and a sense of relief. And I ground and resource in that moment. And the next moment will be something else. But really, it's about those moments and really breathing into and embodying those moments fully that I feel create at most a gap in what seems to be something continuous, because those gaps are present. Yeah, you just have to sit with them a little longer. So just to add to that.
Thank you. Thank you all. We have another question. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Amy has joined us, and Amy has a question.
Hello. I wanted to thank everybody so much. This summit has just been heart and mind expanding. And yeah, thank you so much. Like, on time, talk about being on time. So my question is very much about that. How can white Buddhists be better allies in supporting Black Buddhism and transforming our society using our metta and our awareness. I feel clearly the interconnected nature of all things. And I just desire very much for that to be apparent in what I do and in how Sangha looks.
Amy, let me touch on something, and I'm going to ask you if you will ask actually a different question.
Sure.
Okay. Can you reformulate your thoughts as it relates to trauma on the Black body?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Is it even trauma aware and a holding that is desired to diversify Sangha? When addressing the trauma of racism, which, well, now I'm getting long again, you know, for me, suffering, Buddhism, it's trauma. I totally ground with all of that, and we're all united with that. Is it healing for white Buddhists to try to come into Buddhist spaces where people of color are doing their healing work? Thank you. You helped me reframe a bit. Thank you so much for being also patient.
Thank you. Would anyone like to answer Amy's question?
Very briefly, I'll just say that in Joyfully Just, I talk about how there's a tremendous opportunity available to white people to heal the trauma that racism has caused in your lives, and to do that work with other people and look at the ways that racism has cut off white people's experience of your own humanity. That's the trauma white people have the opportunity to work with.
Their own. Thank you. Thank you. Breeshia, Dr. G?
Yeah, something very similar. So anytime I talk about trauma and grief as it relates to Blackness, what people immediately think of is what it's like to be Black and experience trauma. And of course, that's important. But in my book, particularly what I am calling for is for white people to look at their own relationship to grief and trauma. And because I think the meditation practice can be used one or two ways. One way is to, like, as a relaxation technique, you turn inward, and ignore everything else. And the other is to focus on the suffering of others so you don't have to focus on the suffering of yourself. But if the idea is that we're all in community, and if our grief and suffering is a direct consequence of the actions of white supremacy and white folks in America, then it's important to use the Buddhist practice to come to terms with your own relationships to grief and impermanence, so we aren't experiencing the byproduct of your own trauma.
Thank you, Dr. G. Anything you want to say about this?
I think that's complete. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for your question, your heart. All right, going back to the list, we have another question. This is from Swati Martin. Swati, please join us. You're coming in. You're coming in. Yeah, you're here. Swati.
Hello. Hi.
Hello, your question, please.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, where do you see a relationship between trauma and our individual or collective acceptance or non-acceptance of impermanence? And I guess, the reason I'm asking that, and I haven't seen, I haven't thought through the thread, but we're in an environment where I guess a lot of the fears and a lot of what is going on around us puts us really face to face with impermanence and death. And so, so I wondered if you had maybe some insights to share Thank you.
Thank you, Swati.
Thank you for your question. I think just to normalize the everyday occurrence of the little d deaths. So big D deaths being our ultimate departure from this relative world, and the little d's of transition and as you're naming impermanence. I just incorporate this as part of my work, that this is a part of our human existence, to almost not to minimize the content of trauma, which can kind of make us feel a little bit more elevated, but more to normalize it every moment of every day. We invite actually these small D deaths and ends graciously. Like, we're glad when a work meeting is over. We're super excited we get to go outside from being inside. That that the winter is finally lifting maybe a little bit for some spring. We aren't always inviting and allowing and feeling a sense of control or invitation of these small deaths in every part of our life. And so that is the practice ground for, practicing with impermanence and letting go into what seems to be bigger situations, of more compounded situations where they may be happening seemingly outside of our control or without our permission and invitation, that those two are the same seed from these everyday practices. So even though content is very important, I do sometimes just distill it down to that, so that people know that they have the ability innate within themselves to be able to practice this. And we level up as our beings and our systems and our can support. So thank you for that.
All right, if I may, I'd like to allow for another question to come in. This one is from James Rigson. James Rigson. James, please join us. James. Oh, James. There you are. Welcome, James.
Hey there.
Hey, what's your question, James?
Nice to meet you. I love your smile, Kamilah. Thank you. So a question to do with the relationship between emptiness and identity. I'm a biracial man myself, so my story is a little more nuanced, I guess. But for just as a basic understanding, how does a Black person understand the view of emptiness while still honoring our identity, our strength, our ancestors, and our relative, positive pride in who we are, while also understanding, like, from the point of view of emptiness and impermanence.
I think Buddhism allows for that both and, holding of multiple nuanced realities. Everyone's reality is nuanced. Every species, not even just human species, has a nuanced reality experience. And Buddhism allows us to access all those levels of experience with our intent towards freedom and towards experiencing the most liberated aspect of all those nuanced elements of being.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, Kamilah. One last question, which is not live, which I would like us to end on, because this question invites your imagination. Okay, panelists, Black excellence panelists, here's the question. Is there a way we can experience and encourage post-traumatic growth as a larger society? You each have 1 minute to answer that question. Is there a way we can experience and encourage post-traumatic growth as a larger society?
I'll go first. Yeah, I believe so. I believe that the purpose, or one of the gifts that the practice gives us, or two gifts, are ourselves and each other. So the practice invites us to return to ourselves as a site of potential and a site of healing amidst suffering. It invites us to have an intimate relationship with the reality of impermanence and grief, and therefore trauma as a result of our grief. And kind of piggybacking or thinking through the question of emptiness, I think one of the tools that can be used in actualizing that that future movement towards healing is emptiness, because I actually look at emptiness as a form of fullness. And that didn't come from me. Look up Zenju Earthla Manuel. She's brilliant. But she had a beautiful insight about what it means to be empty in this practice, and what it means to become interconnected and to move towards healing as a result of leaning into emptiness and embracing our reality of impermanence. So again, I'm going to bookend that with yes. I do think that's possible, and the practice leads the way.
Thank you, Breeshia. Kamilah, Dr. G, in 45 seconds each. What do you have to say?
I say yes, it is happening. We are seeing it, right? The nation experienced so much trauma recently. Even let's just go back to January. We don't have to go back. We actually don't even have to go back to January. But what happened on January 6th was like, oh, we could all be killed by white supremacists. So the growth that's occurred there is that everybody is aware that not only are white supremacists dangerous to African heritage and other global majority folks, white supremacy is a dangerous notion. So there's a level of post-traumatic growth that is occurring right before our very eyes, because people are recognizing things they haven't had to recognize before. At the same time, some intentionality for that growth to continue, that people have to make a decision. We each, in each moment, have to make a decision to turn towards the suffering and decide to grow. That's the only way you get the growth.
Thank you. Dr. G.
And I would just like to end all that with be in celebration. I think, again, since so much is happening, like we just named, something happened the 6th, something happened last week, something's happening every day. But can we be in community, and even if it's just one other person, to be in celebration for stating and naming, hey, I made it through this. I faced this bit of suffering, and here I am on the other side. I think as a community, that witnessing really helps us grow, recall our resources, and continue that growth and acknowledgement of one another.
Thank you. So before I thank you all, I have a special message for Breeshia's grandmother. Your grandmother is like many of our other grandmothers and grandparents. Our people want to know, was their sacrifice worth it? If it appears we are leaving all that they created for us, right? So Grandma, I want to tell you something, and I want to all grandmothers and all grandparents this. We love you. We adore you. We respect you. We honor you. We praise you. We are using everything that you've given us, that you've passed down, and we are fertilizing the soil for the next generations to be able to do the things that we couldn't do, like we're doing the things that you couldn't do. We don't always know what it's going to look like. We don't always know who we're going to love. We don't know why Buddhism came into our lives, but it's wisdom that we seek and we embrace. So I hope that's okay, Breeshia, that I gave your grandmother that message. I don't know you, Grandma, but I know something about grandmothers and grandparents because I was raised by them. And so thank you for Breeshia. We're going to thank you, Grandma, for all that you did to bring Breeshia, thanking your grandparents, Kamilah, thanking your grandparents, Dr. G, and thanking you all for joining us on this day for this conversation about being Black and Buddhist and recognizing and working with our trauma. And yes, there's a possibility of post-traumatic growth. Thank you all. Thank you for your questions too.
And thank you, Dr. Yetunde, for your masterful stewardship of the summit.
Thank you.
100%.
Thank y'all.
And to my co-presenters, deep gratitude.
Yes.
Mhm, mhm.
Yes.